The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Ouagadougou as Captain Ibrahim Traoré reviewed the intelligence reports on his desk. The young military leader had been receiving disturbing information about unusual activities in the northern regions of Burkina Faso. Local villagers reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles moving at night, and several community leaders had gone missing without explanation. 3 weeks earlier, a farmer named Musa had approached the military base with trembling hands, clutching a piece of torn fabric he claimed belonged to strangers who had been asking questions about water sources and mining locations. The fabric was expensive, foreign-made, and bore traces of sophisticated equipment that didn't belong to any known local organizations. Ibrahim's trusted aide, Lieutenant Sankara, burst into the office with urgent news. A patrol unit had intercepted radio communications in a language that wasn't French, Arabic, or any local dialect. The encrypted messages mentioned coordinates that matched several strategic locations across the country, including government buildings and military installations. The intelligence team had been working around the clock to decode these messages. What they discovered sent chills down Ibrahim's spine. The communications revealed a network of operatives conducting surveillance on Burkina Faso's gold mines, uranium deposits, and key infrastructure. More alarming was the mention of population displacement scenarios and resource extraction timelines. Ibrahim knew that Burkina Faso's mineral wealth had always attracted foreign interest, but this seemed different. The level of sophistication and the systematic nature of the operation suggested state-level involvement. The country had recently strengthened its ties with Russia and had been moving away from French influence, making it a target for various international interests. As he studied satellite images provided by Allied intelligence services, Ibrahim noticed patterns of movement that coincided with the mysterious radio transmissions. Small teams were positioning themselves near critical infrastructure, and their behavior suggested advanced military training. The breakthrough came when a local mechanic in Dori reported repairing a vehicle with unusual modifications. The man described hidden compartments, advanced communication equipment, and license plates that could be electronically changed. Most importantly, he had overheard the occupants speaking in Hebrew and mentioning Operation Desert Shield. Ibrahim realized they were dealing with a highly organized covert operation. The foreign operatives weren't just gathering intelligence, they were preparing for something much larger. The mention of population displacement suggested they might be planning to create instability that would justify international intervention. The young leader faced a critical decision. He could alert international partners, but that risked the information leaking to the wrong people. He could wait and gather more evidence, but that might allow the operation to reach completion. Or he could take direct action, knowing that confronting foreign operatives could have serious diplomatic consequences. Ibrahim chose action over hesitation. He assembled a small team of his most trusted officers and began planning a counter-operation. They would need to capture at least some of these operatives alive to understand the full scope of the threat. The stakes were enormous, not just for Burkina Faso, but potentially for the entire region. Late that evening, as Ibrahim prepared for what could be the most important operation of his military career, he reflected on the responsibility weighing on his shoulders. The safety of 12 million Burkinabe citizens depended on making the right decisions in the coming days. He had risen to power promising to protect his country's sovereignty, and now that promise would be tested in ways he had never imagined. The intelligence reports painted a picture of a sophisticated network with access to advanced technology and significant financial resources. Ibrahim suspected they were dealing with a major intelligence service, but he needed proof. Tomorrow, the hunt would begin, and the future of Burkina Faso might hang in the balance. The operation began before dawn, with Ibrahim personally leading a team of elite soldiers toward the suspected safe house in the town of Kaya. Intelligence had pinpointed the location through careful analysis of vehicle movements and communication patterns. The building appeared to be an ordinary compound, but thermal imaging revealed it housed more people than it should for a typical residence. Ibrahim's strategy was methodical. Rather than rushing in, his team established a perimeter and began systematic surveillance. They needed to understand the operatives' routines, identify escape routes, and determine the best moment to strike without alerting other cells that might be operating elsewhere in the country. For 3 days, they watched as individuals came and went from the compound. The occupants displayed behavioral patterns that confirmed Ibrahim's suspicions. They moved with military precision, maintained irregular schedules to avoid predictability, and used vehicles that changed license plates daily. Most telling was their habit of switching mobile phones every few hours, a classic counter-surveillance technique. On the third night, opportunity presented itself. 2 of the suspects left the compound alone, heading toward the main market area. Ibrahim's team followed at a distance, waiting for the right moment. When the 2 men stopped at an isolated fuel station on the outskirts of town, Ibrahim gave the signal. The capture was swift and professional. Within minutes, both suspects were secured and transported to a secure facility. Initial searches revealed sophisticated communication equipment, false identification documents from multiple countries, and detailed maps of Burkina Faso marking strategic locations with coded symbols. The interrogation revealed more than Ibrahim had dared hope. The first operative, who identified himself only as David, initially claimed to be a businessman interested in agricultural investments. However, his equipment told a different story. Hidden in his belongings were detailed architectural plans of the presidential palace, military installations, and key infrastructure including power plants and communication towers. The second operative proved more difficult. Identifying himself as Michael, he maintained complete silence for hours, but when confronted with evidence of his activities, including photographs taken during his surveillance operations, his resolve began to crack. He admitted to being part of a larger operation, but insisted he was only gathering economic intelligence. Ibrahim knew they needed more than these 2 individuals to understand the full scope of the threat. Late that evening, a breakthrough came when technical specialists managed to decrypt some of the captured communication devices. The messages revealed a network of at least 12 operatives spread across the country, with support from assets in neighboring Ghana and Ivory Coast. More disturbing was the discovery of financial transfers totaling millions of dollars, originating from accounts in Tel Aviv and channeled through various offshore companies. The money trail suggested a long-term operation, with significant backing from the Israeli intelligence services. The operatives weren't just conducting surveillance, they were building infrastructure for potential future operations. One decrypted message mentioned, Phase 2 implementation pending government destabilization. Another referenced, mining rights secured through alternative means if diplomatic channels fail. Ibrahim realized they were dealing with a comprehensive plan to potentially overthrow his government and install a more compliant regime. The investigation took an unexpected turn when one of the captured phones received an urgent message in Hebrew. When translated, it read, "Package delivery delayed. Increase pressure on northern targets, prepare contingency protocols." This suggested the operation was entering a more active phase, possibly involving violence against civilians to create justification for international intervention. Ibrahim faced a growing dilemma. Each piece of evidence pointed to a major international conspiracy against Burkina Faso's sovereignty. However, confronting Israel directly could have serious consequences for his country's international relationships. Many African nations maintained complex diplomatic ties with Israel, and accusations without absolute proof could backfire diplomatically. As the 4th day of interrogations began, Ibrahim decided to expand the operation. If there were 12 operatives in the country, he needed to capture more of them to fully understand their mission. The race was on to round up the entire network before they could execute whatever plan they had been preparing for months. The stakes continued to rise as Ibrahim's team intercepted communications, suggesting the operatives had backup plans involving neighboring countries. The conspiracy was larger than initially thought, potentially affecting regional stability across West Africa. Using information extracted from the captured operatives, Ibrahim launched simultaneous raids across 3 provinces. His team struck at dawn, targeting safe houses in Bobo Dioulasso, Banfora, and Tenkodogo. The coordinated operation required precise timing to prevent the remaining operatives from escaping or destroying evidence. The raid in Bobo Dioulasso yielded the most significant results. The team discovered a sophisticated communications center equipped with satellite uplinks, encrypted computers, and detailed surveillance equipment. More importantly, they found hard drives containing months of intelligence gathering on Burkina Faso's political leadership, military capabilities, and economic infrastructure. Among the captured materials were psychological profiles of key government officials, including Ibrahim himself. The files revealed an intimate knowledge of personal relationships, family connections, and potential pressure points that could be exploited. Someone had been feeding detailed information to the operatives for months, suggesting the presence of local collaborators within the government or military. The revelation of internal betrayal hit Ibrahim harder than the foreign espionage itself. The psychological profiles mentioned his childhood in Bondoukoui, his military training, and even personal details about his family that should have been known only to close associates. This level of insider knowledge meant the conspiracy reached into the highest levels of Burkinabe society. In Banfora, the team uncovered evidence of the operation's economic dimensions. Documents detailed plans for acquiring mining rights to significant gold and uranium deposits through a combination of bribery, political pressure, and, if necessary, regime change. The operatives had identified specific government officials who could be bought or coerced into supporting favorable mining contracts for Israeli companies. The uranium deposits were particularly significant, as they represented strategic resources valuable not just economically but for potential military applications. The documents suggested plans to establish exclusive extraction rights that would effectively give Israel control over Burkina Faso's nuclear materials, despite the country's official policy of maintaining sovereignty over its natural resources. The IC Tenkodogo raid produced perhaps the most alarming discovery: detailed plans for false flag operations designed to create instability. The documents outlined scenarios where attacks on civilian targets would be blamed on terrorist groups, providing justification for international intervention. The plans were sophisticated, showing deep understanding of regional politics and international law regarding humanitarian interventions. One document titled Operation Northern Storm detailed how coordinated attacks on schools and markets in northern Burkina Faso would be blamed on existing jihadist groups. The international community would then pressure the government to accept foreign military assistance, creating opportunities for further penetration by Israeli interests. The cynical calculation of innocent lives as acceptable casualties shocked even Ibrahim's experienced intelligence officers. As interrogations continued, a clearer picture emerged of the operation's scope and timeline. The network had been active for over 2 years, gradually building assets and preparing for what they called the decisive phase. This phase was scheduled to begin within weeks, coinciding with upcoming regional elections that could potentially weaken Ibrahim's government. The captured operatives revealed the existence of backup plans involving neighboring countries. If the Burkina Faso operation failed, similar networks in Ghana, Mali, and Niger would be activated. The goal was regional destabilization that would create opportunities for resource extraction across the entire Sahel region under the guise of international peacekeeping operations. Financial records showed payments to several high-ranking officials in multiple West African countries. Some names on the list shocked Ibrahim, individuals he had considered allies in regional cooperation. Efforts were apparently compromised. The corruption network extended far beyond Burkina Faso, suggesting a systematic effort to influence governance across the region. The investigation took another turn when technical analysis revealed that some of the surveillance equipment had been manufactured specifically for this operation. Serial numbers traced back to Israeli defense contractors, confirming state-level involvement. This wasn't rogue intelligence officers operating independently. This was an official operation with significant resources and government backing. Most disturbing was the discovery of medical supplies and documentation suggesting plans for biological warfare scenarios. While the captured materials didn't contain actual biological agents, the preparatory documentation indicated consideration of creating health emergencies that would require international intervention. The level of calculation and disregard for human life demonstrated in these plans was unprecedented. Ibrahim realized he was confronting not just espionage but a comprehensive plan for neo-colonial control, disguised as humanitarian intervention and economic development. The sophistication of the operation suggested years of planning and significant financial investment. His small, landlocked country was facing one of the world's most advanced intelligence services in what appeared to be a test case for similar operations across Africa. The breakthrough in understanding the full conspiracy came from an unexpected source. One of the captured operatives, under psychological pressure from days of interrogation, began revealing details about coordination with other international actors. What Ibrahim discovered challenged his understanding of modern geopolitics and the forces working against African independence. The operative, who finally identified himself as Agent Benjamin Katz, explained that the Burkina Faso operation was part of a broader initiative called Project Sahara Gateway. The project aimed to establish Israeli influence across the Sahel region through a combination of intelligence operations, economic penetration, and political manipulation. Burkina Faso was chosen as the test case due to its recent shift away from French influence and its significant mineral resources. Katz revealed that the operation had been planned in coordination with certain elements within the French intelligence services who were unhappy about losing influence in their former colonies. These rogue French operatives provided local knowledge and existing networks in exchange for guaranteed access to uranium resources that France needed for its nuclear program. The cooperation represented an unholy alliance between former colonial powers seeking to maintain control through new methods. The documents recovered from the safe houses painted a picture of breathtaking cynicism. Plans existed to create refugee crises that would destabilize neighboring countries, while simultaneously positioning Israeli humanitarian organizations as saviors providing aid. These same organizations would then establish permanent presences that could serve intelligence gathering and political influence operations. Economic warfare formed another pillar of the conspiracy. Israeli companies working through shell corporations registered in tax havens had been systematically underbidding local contractors for major infrastructure projects. Once established, these companies would create dependencies that could be leveraged for political concessions. The captured files showed similar operations in progress across multiple African countries. Ibrahim's intelligence team uncovered evidence of the operation's propaganda component. Social media manipulation campaigns had been running for months, designed to undermine confidence in his government while promoting narratives that would justify international intervention. Fake news stories about human rights violations, economic mismanagement, and security failures had been planted across various platforms, creating a false justification for external involvement. The psychological warfare aspect was particularly sophisticated. The operatives had been studying traditional Burkinabe society, identifying cultural pressure points that could be exploited to create division. Plans existed to inflame ethnic tensions between different groups, create religious conflicts, and undermine traditional authority structures that supported national unity. One of the most disturbing discoveries was evidence of attempted recruitment among Burkina Faso's youth. Scholarship programs, cultural exchange initiatives, and technology training courses had been used as covers for identifying and cultivating future assets within Burkinabe society. Young people from influential families had been particular targets, with some unknowingly providing information about their parents' activities in government and business. The investigation revealed that several recent terrorist attacks in the region hadn't been carried out by jihadist groups as originally believed, but were false flag operations designed to create instability. Evidence suggested Israeli operatives had provided weapons and training to criminal groups, directing them to conduct attacks that would be blamed on existing terrorist organizations. The goal was to create security crises that would justify international military intervention. Financial analysis of the captured documents showed the operation's enormous scope. Over $50 million had been allocated for the Burkina Faso operation alone, with similar amounts dedicated to operations in other West African countries. The funding came through a complex network of charitable foundations, technology companies, and investment funds, all ultimately traceable to Israeli government sources. The captured communication devices revealed ongoing coordination with assets in neighboring countries. Messages indicated that if the Burkina Faso operation succeeded, similar operations would be accelerated in Ghana, Togo, and Benin. The ultimate goal appeared to be creating an arc of Israeli influence across West Africa, controlling key resources and strategic positions. Perhaps most shocking was evidence of coordination with international financial institutions. Documents suggested that certain officials within the World Bank and International Monetary Fund had been providing information about African countries' economic vulnerabilities. This information was being used to time economic pressures that would coincide with political destabilization efforts. The operatives had also been gathering detailed intelligence on China's Belt and Road Initiative projects in the region. Plans existed to sabotage Chinese infrastructure investments while positioning Israeli alternatives as more reliable partners. This represented a new dimension of great power competition playing out on African soil, with African nations as unwitting battlegrounds. As Ibrahim processed the full scope of what his team had uncovered, he realized they had stumbled upon one of the most comprehensive foreign interference operations in modern African history. The implications extended far beyond Burkina Faso's borders, potentially affecting the sovereignty and development of the entire continent. The question now was what to do with this explosive information without triggering diplomatic crises or international retaliation. Ibrahim faced the delicate challenge of how to handle the explosive revelations without triggering international incidents that could harm Burkina Faso's interests. The evidence was overwhelming, but the diplomatic implications of publicly exposing a major intelligence operation involving allied nations required careful consideration. His first step was to quietly reach out to trusted African leaders who might be facing similar threats. President Mohamed Déby of Chad and President Mohamed Bazoum of Niger had both mentioned unusual foreign activities in their countries during recent regional meetings. Ibrahim arranged discreet meetings to share intelligence without initially revealing the full scope of what he had discovered. The response was immediate and alarming. Both leaders confirmed they had been experiencing similar infiltration attempts. Niger's intelligence services had been tracking suspicious Israeli businessmen conducting unauthorized surveys near uranium mines. Chad had intercepted communications, suggesting foreign operatives were mapping oil infrastructure and studying tribal dynamics that could be exploited for political purposes. Ibrahim realized that Project Sahara Gateway was even larger than the captured documents had suggested. The conspiracy involved systematic penetration of multiple African governments, with the goal of creating a network of dependent states that could be controlled through economic leverage and political manipulation. Working with his counterparts, Ibrahim began building a coalition of African leaders committed to exposing and countering the foreign interference. However, they discovered that some regional governments had already been compromised. Intelligence sharing revealed that officials in several countries had been receiving payments or other benefits in exchange for cooperation with the operation. The situation became more complex when intercepted communications revealed that some African Union officials had been providing information to the Israeli operatives. The continental organization that was supposed to protect African sovereignty had been penetrated at the highest levels. This discovery shook Ibrahim's faith in Pan-African institutions and highlighted how deep the conspiracy had reached. International pressure began mounting as word of the captured operatives spread through diplomatic channels. The Israeli government initially denied any knowledge of the operation, claiming the captured individuals were rogue actors operating without authorization. However, the sophisticated equipment and significant funding made such denials difficult to believe. French President Emmanuel Macron personally called Ibrahim, expressing concern about the situation and offering assistance in investigating the matter. However, given the evidence of French intelligence cooperation with the Israeli operation, Ibrahim treated these overtures with extreme skepticism. The conversation was cordial, but revealed the complex web of competing interests that African leaders had to navigate. The United States government took a different approach, with State Department officials suggesting that the captured individuals might have been conducting legitimate business activities that were misunderstood. American economic interests in the region created conflicting pressures, as U.S. companies also wanted access to Africa's resources and markets. Ibrahim's decision to share selective information with the Chinese government proved strategic. China had significant investments across Africa and a strong interest in preventing Western interference in the continent. Chinese intelligence services confirmed they had been tracking similar operations and offered technological assistance in securing Burkina Faso's communications and infrastructure. The Russian government's response was perhaps most supportive, with officials expressing solidarity against what they characterized as Western neo-colonialism. Russia offered military advisors and advanced counterintelligence equipment to help African nations defend against similar operations. However, Ibrahim was careful not to become too dependent on any single international partner. Media coverage of the incident began appearing in international outlets, though the full scope of the revelations was carefully controlled. Ibrahim's government released information gradually, allowing international pressure to build while avoiding accusations of anti-Semitism or diplomatic overreach. The strategy was to let the evidence speak for itself, rather than making inflammatory accusations. The captured operatives' home country faced growing pressure as more details emerged about the operation's scope and methods. International human rights organizations began questioning the use of false flag operations and plans to create refugee crises. The reputational damage was significant, particularly given Israel's frequent criticism of other nations' intelligence activities. Economic retaliation began subtly, with several African countries reviewing mining contracts and business agreements with Israeli companies. The discovery of the conspiracy had created a trust deficit that would take years to repair, regardless of the immediate diplomatic resolution. Regional security cooperation intensified as African intelligence services began sharing information more systematically. The revelation that external actors were conducting sophisticated operations across multiple countries created a new sense of urgency about continental security cooperation. The African Union announced plans for enhanced counterintelligence coordination. Ibrahim recognized that successfully managing this crisis could establish him as a leader in the movement for genuine African independence from neo-colonial influence. However, the risks were enormous. Powerful international actors had been exposed, and they would certainly attempt to undermine his government in retaliation. The next phase would test whether small African nations could successfully resist major power interference when they stood together. 6 months after the initial capture of the operatives, Ibrahim stood before the African Union Assembly in Addis Ababa, preparing to deliver what many considered the most important speech about African sovereignty in decades. The evidence his team had gathered had been meticulously verified by independent experts from multiple countries, creating an unassailable case for systematic foreign interference across the continent. The diplomatic resolution had been complex and delicate. Rather than pursuing public prosecution that could have escalated into international incidents, Ibrahim had chosen a strategy of diplomatic pressure and institutional reform. The captured operatives were quietly expelled after extensive debriefing, while their governments faced private but firm demands for guarantees against future interference. The Israeli government eventually acknowledged that unauthorized activities had occurred and implemented new oversight mechanisms for international business operations. While falling short of a full admission, this response allowed for face-saving diplomacy while establishing precedents for accountability. Several high-ranking officials quietly resigned, and promised reforms in intelligence oversight were announced. French cooperation in addressing the conspiracy proved more complicated, as elements within the French intelligence services had clearly been involved. President Macron eventually agreed to a comprehensive review of France's Africa policy, including the withdrawal of certain military advisors and the restructuring of economic agreements. The CFA franc system faced renewed criticism and calls for reform. The captured documents had provided African governments with unprecedented insight into how foreign powers were attempting to maintain neo-colonial control through modern methods. This intelligence proved invaluable in developing counter-strategies and strengthening continental cooperation against external interference. Ibrahim's handling of the crisis had transformed him from a relatively unknown military leader into a continental figure representing African resistance to foreign manipulation. His careful balance of firmness with diplomacy had shown that small African nations could successfully confront major powers when they worked together and built strong alliances. The economic implications of the revelations proved significant. Several mining contracts were renegotiated to ensure more favorable terms for African countries. New transparency requirements were implemented for foreign investments, making it harder for intelligence operations to hide behind business activities. Regional cooperation on resource extraction increased, reducing dependence on individual foreign partnerships. Counterintelligence capabilities across the continent improved dramatically as African nations shared the techniques and technologies they had learned from analyzing the Israeli operation. Training programs were established to help African intelligence services identify and counter similar operations. The crisis had inadvertently strengthened African security cooperation. The social media manipulation campaigns that had been uncovered led to new initiatives to protect African information environments. Media literacy programs were expanded, and regulations were developed to prevent foreign actors from exploiting social divisions. African tech companies gained support to develop alternatives to foreign-controlled platforms. Ibrahim's government used the crisis to strengthen democratic institutions within Burkina Faso. The revelation of how foreign powers had attempted to exploit political divisions led to new emphasis on national unity and civic education. Constitutional reforms were implemented to make the government more resistant to external pressure and manipulation. The youth recruitment aspects of the operation led to comprehensive reviews of educational exchange programs and foreign scholarships. New screening procedures were implemented to prevent intelligence services from exploiting educational opportunities to recruit assets. However, legitimate educational cooperation continued with proper oversight. International support for Ibrahim's position grew as more evidence emerged about similar operations in other regions. Latin American and Asian countries that had experienced comparable interference expressed solidarity with African efforts to resist neo-colonial manipulation. A global movement for sovereignty protection began taking shape. The uranium and gold, resources that had been targets of the operation, remained under Burkinabe control, but new international partnerships were developed to ensure fair pricing and prevent any single country from gaining excessive influence. Diversified partnerships with China, Russia, Turkey, and other nations reduced dependence on traditional Western allies. As Ibrahim reflected on the events that had transformed his country and his own role on the continental stage, he recognized that the battle for African independence was far from over. The methods of control had evolved, but the fundamental challenge remained the same: how to maintain sovereignty while engaging productively with the global community. The operation had revealed both the sophistication of modern neo-colonial strategies and the potential for African resistance when properly organized and coordinated. It had shown that with careful intelligence work, diplomatic skill, and continental cooperation, African nations could successfully defend their sovereignty against even the most advanced foreign interference. The future would bring new challenges, but the precedent had been established. Foreign powers now knew that African nations were capable of detecting and countering sophisticated intelligence operations. The continent had demonstrated that it would not passively accept manipulation, regardless of the source or the methods employed. Ibrahim's legacy was secure. He had not only protected his own country, but had helped establish new standards for African resistance to foreign interference. The young military leader who had promised to defend Burkina Faso's sovereignty had ended up defending the sovereignty of an entire continent.